and belonging, where we talk about literally everything DEI and B and all the alphabet soup under the sun. And I am thrilled to be joined by Solomon Wilkins today. Solomon and I, the very first time we had a conversation, I wish that we had been recording. So I'm glad that we're having this conversation with cameras rolling. Solomon, introduce yourself and let's dig in and talk about this work.
Well, Maureen, thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here and share a little insights. My name is Solomon Wilkins. I am the head of inclusion and diversity at Synopsys. We are an electronic design automation company, or EDA, as most people would categorize it. We do software tools for designing electronic systems. We're focused on silicon design and verification, silicon intellectual property, and software security, a bunch of really, really technical work. We have a workforce of about 16,000 people in about 30 countries around the world. And I am responsible for designing, developing, implementing our R&D strategy along with some of my amazing coworkers. So I'm excited to be here and share some insights.
So just a small role.
Not that big, not that big.
Well, and speaking of that, so what actually influenced you to get into, and I love even the fact that you call it inclusion and diversity, you lead with the I. Yeah. What influenced you and what motivated you to do this work?
Yeah, I'll talk about the reason I lead with the I, if there's an opportunity to a little bit later. But what influenced my thinking around the work at a young age, and although I didn't know it at the time, my mother not only influenced my thinking around I&D, but she's the reason I'm so passionate about the work. I have an abundance of examples that I could use to illustrate how my mom influenced me to do this work, but for the sake of time, I'll share just one. When I was between the ages of 7 and 9, we had a neighbor who used to come to our house a lot. And at that age, I had no idea what it meant to be gay, right? I'm 7 and 9 years old. This is in the 80s in Oakland, California. It's not something that was talked about. And I'm not sure my mother knew what it meant to be gay either. But the one thing my mother used to always tell me at an early age is, Solomon, it doesn't matter if someone is gay or straight, black or brown, man or woman, treat people with respect and always be willing to listen, because you can learn from someone else's experience. So again, I was between the ages of 7 and 9. I had no idea what she was talking about. But one night I remember her and Darren, who is the neighbor who used to visit. Darren used to come over, and I remember Darren saying to my mom's name was Audrey. He said, Audrey, I love you more than you know, because you're the only person to accept me for who I am, and you've never judged me. Darren was a gay man. At the time, it was just two friends having a conversation, right? And I'm just a kid in the room listening. But as I got older and I start reflecting on life, that conversation and my mom's relationship with Darren, it stuck out to me, because before it was a popular thing to do, my mother had this innate ability to make space for people. She knew how to make them feel important. She showed empathy and compassion, and she knew how to listen. So my mom at a very early age influenced not only how I do this work, but why I advocate for people the way I do.
First, that we could all have mothers like yours.
She was pretty phenomenal. She was my best friend. Yeah.
Yeah. And there was so much in there. You talked about respect. You talked about listening. You talked about holding space. You talked about being non-judgmental. And when I think about the foundation of inclusion and belonging, it's all of that, right?
Yeah.
And so, and we often say in this work, it's hard, it's messy, and the kids are watching. And you are such a great example of the kids are watching. And what happens when the kids are watching just this model of inclusion.
And to that point, it's one of the reasons I'm so understanding with leaders who don't understand why inclusion and diversity matters, because we're all products of our environment.
Yes.
And it doesn't give someone an excuse not to create an environment of inclusion or belonging. but a lot of times they don't know how to do it. It's not something that's been emphasized. It's not something that's been talked about. Depending on who their parents were and how they grew up, it shaped a lot of our behaviors as we get older, right? And my mom just so happened to be a person who outwardly advocated for inclusion. But there are a lot of people who parents did the opposite, right? And then when you get older, the older you get, the harder it becomes to adapt your thinking to the world that we're living in. And so that's where a lot of, the one-on-one conversations come from, the passion comes from it, and really helping people understand why the work matters to them.
So, it's interesting. We're a couple of years ago now. It might have even, I know it was at least 2 years ago, we did a thing on inclusion around the Thanksgiving table.
Yeah.
Right. And just starting with let's just start with the premise of Thanksgiving and how fraught with problems that is from an inclusion standpoint. And we say the inclusion starts in our homes. And there are some things that so much that we have to unlearn because we don't, we didn't all have the gift of a mother like yours. So I can see, right? So you're young, you're seeing this model that's leading you to the work. What do you love the most about doing this work? I think I know, and I'm going to be really interested to see if my intuition on this one is right.
I love the light bulb moments. Right? I love helping people understand, I mentioned it briefly before, why this work matters to them. But it's not easy, right? And it's not about why it matters to me or why it matters to the company. It's why it matters to them. And I think a lot of times we get caught up in the political side of the work where we have to represent the company. And that's important, right? But the reality of inclusion and diversity work is a lot of times people won't get it until they understand why it matters to them. At a previous employer, I was preparing for an executive conversation, and the consensus was that I was wasting my time preparing for this conversation because the executive I was going to have a conversation with, he didn't care about diversity. So when I get that kind of feedback, I get excited because I really believe that everyone cares about diversity once we help them identify why it's important to them. Now, again, the distinction is not why it's important to Solomon or not why it's important to the company, but why it's important to them. Can I share a brief story to illustrate this example?
Absolutely. Your stories are powerful, Solomon.
Thank you. So at a previous employer, again, I was preparing for an executive conversation. And so I get to the conversation and I have all this in the back of my head. He doesn't care about diversity. He doesn't care about inclusion. He cares about the bottom line. Right. And so one of the things I do in my initial conversations is I tell them intentionally, listen, I didn't come in here with a PowerPoint. I didn't come in here with some talking points. I really just want to spend time getting to know you. And I'm intentional when I say this. I want to get to know you outside of the work you do professionally, because the reality is we all have family. We all, regardless of what our relationship is with them, we all have friends. We all have a life outside of work. So that normally, it allows them to put their guards down and just talk about life. And in this particular conversation, a long story short, I came to find out that this executive had a gay daughter. And this was an Asian man. He was born and raised in China. And he said to me, he was like, not only is my daughter gay, but it's an embarrassment for my country, my community, my family. I'm embarrassed. And I said, so what's your relationship like with your daughter? And he said, we don't talk. We haven't talked. And it's almost been a year. And he said, I just can't accept the fact that she's gay. I said, do you miss her? And when I asked him, did he miss her? He started crying. I asked the question intentionally because before she identified as gay, before any of that, she was just his little girl, right? And I said, when he started crying, I said, what do you miss the most about her? I wanted to keep pushing. What do you miss the most about her, right? And he gave me a couple of examples, and I said, why can't you have that relationship with her now? And he said, because she's gay. He said, not only is she gay, she's married to a Black woman. And so I was comfortable with the fact that he said that, me being a Black man. It meant that his walls were coming down and he was becoming more comfortable, right? And so as we continued the conversation, I always want to give him the solution, give the leader the solution. So my question back to him was, what would you like the relationship with your daughter to be like? He described it perfectly. I said, how could you go about making that relationship happen? He described it perfectly. He was scared to reach out because he said some really hurtful things. I gave him some talking points. I told him to just send her a text. He sent her a text. She responded right away. They eventually got on the phone. He apologized. This was over the course of weeks. He apologized. He cried. He told her he missed her. He invited her and her wife, because they got married, to his home. Long story short, he rekindled his relationship with his daughter. And then at the end of that, my question to him was, now, if your daughter was struggling with you not accepting her as her parent, what do you think she's going through at work? You're the person that should love her more than anybody in the world. So if you pushed her away, what do you think's happening at work? And then I asked the final question. What do you think is happening to your employees who could be experiencing something similar? He said he had never thought about that before. So not only did he rekindle his relationship with his daughter, but he became one of my biggest advocates across the company for all things inclusion and diversity related. And he shared that story so many times, and people were flabbergasted because they were like, I would have never thought you could get to him. But again, I made the story relevant by making it important to him. Again, why does the work matter to him? So that's what I love most about doing the work, watching those light bulb moments happen for people.
Yeah, and always connecting it back. Everybody has a story like that, right? Everybody has, and I loved that the connection of dots that you made for him about his story and his employees' experiences.
Yeah.
Right. To really and to feel it. I think there's a lot of this that's about feeling. It makes me a little bit frustrated isn't quite the word, but when people are like, show me the business case, I'm like, enough. Right? Like, we're so far past that, and the business case is not going to get you to change behaviors.
Bingo. That's what I always say, right? Like, do you really, the business case is out there. You can Google it and find the business case in 10 seconds, right? But if someone's asking me for the business case, there's some other things that play.
There's way more to unpack, isn't there? The package is big.
Way more.
So, and I think that this is actually when we think about challenges in this work, right? I think that's some of it. What do you see as some of your greatest challenges in leading I&D strategy?
You just answered the question for me. Like, what I see as one of the biggest challenges is helping leaders understand not only why I&D matters, but why it's good for business, right? But think about it through a different lens. And this is the perspective that I try to teach and share with my peers, because it'll allow you to be more patient when doing the work, right? Think through the lens of an executive. Most executives are older because it takes time to promote to that level of your career. When I say executive, I'm saying VP, SVP, right? And more than likely, as they elevated professionally, diversity wasn't something that they had to focus on. So imagine being a vice president or a senior vice president, and you spent 20 plus years in your career doing it your way, hiring who you want, developing who you wanted. You see an employee who reminds you of yourself when you were young, you're going to put your time into that employee. And more than likely, because they remind you of yourself, they're probably the same race and gender as you are, right? And then all of a sudden, after 20 plus years, some 30 plus years, the company introduces a new concept which focuses on race and gender. Now, we know that inclusion and diversity encompasses a lot more than race and gender. Right. But on the surface, that's what most people think it is. So not only does the new strategy focus on race and gender, but it's focused on hiring women and Black, Latin, and Indigenous people. Now think about the stereotypes associated with women and Black, Latin, and Indigenous people, right? So for women, it's that they have a baby. If they have a baby, they may want to stay at home, which will negatively impact the business. So they don't want to take that risk and hire a woman. Well, I'm a married man. And if my wife has another baby, I would want to stay at home too, right? So that should go out the window. And then you think about like the stereotypes associated with Black, Latin, and Indigenous people, right? It's that they're lazy, they're not as smart as the other people, etc. So in my mind, in the mind of the leader, and that's the key, in the leader's mind, they think we're telling them to hire less qualified candidates. Throughout my career, I've consistently been asked the question. So if we have to focus on women and BLIs, do we have to hire a less qualified candidate?
Are we going to lower the bar?
Are we going to lower the hiring bar? And then my question is, why would that be an assumption because we're hiring women and BLIs? Because if we put out a quota to say, not even a quota, if we built a strategy that said we wanted to hire more white men and Asian men, you would never hear the question, do we have to lower the hiring bar? Because the assumption is they're automatically smart enough, right? And so
they get the positive bias
all the time, right? And so as we continue to do this work, it's important for us to be patient, but then continue to help leaders understand why this work is important for the business. But there's data all across the world that you can look that will show you that diversity increases engagement, increases productivity, and increases profitability. So the data will say, if your employees are more engaged, they're going to come to work more. When they come to work more and they're happier, they're more productive. And when they're more productive, guess who wins? The company, because the company is more profitable. And companies with diverse leadership teams are 35% more profitable than companies without. And although the data will tell us that, if you lead with that in a meeting, leaders won't hear it because they'll consistently say, oh, that may work for other companies, but that won't work for ours. And it's really hard to have this discussion with leaders when the company's really successful, right? Like
totally. And
really successful.
When they've been successful. So you're asking me to do something else, but everything, right? I've gotten here and here and here. Why am I changing?
I've started as an employee, then a manager, then a senior manager, then a director, then a senior director, then a VP, then an SVP, and I've done it my way. Now, all of a sudden, you want me to do something different. On top of that, you want me to hire people from demographics that I already have biases towards, but I'm not going to publicly tell you what my biases are, but I have them, right? It's a lot to deal with.
Well, and I think that loops back, right, to creating those light bulb moments, right? And connecting it to, because otherwise these hurdles are too high.
Yeah.
And that means doing like some pick and shovel work, right? There's no silver bullet here. There's a lot of conversations, right? There's a lot of getting key people one-on-one understanding and connecting back to, there really is not a silver bullet, as much as we'd all love to have one. So in what regards then do you think about this work differently than other leaders and practitioners?
I think that for me, I hear diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging. There's, like you said at the beginning, there's alphabet soup, right? I think before anything, there has to be inclusion, right? So my perspective is to always focus on inclusion and then focus on diversity. Now, I'm not saying diversity isn't just as important. As a matter of fact, if I had to rank them, I would say inclusion is 1 and diversity is 1A. So they're right on the same lines. But I've been a part of teams that were considered diverse, but no one felt included. And because of that, you didn't get the maximum productivity, the company didn't get the maximum profitability, and we weren't an engaged team. Conversely, I've been on teams that weren't as diverse, but everybody felt included because the leader did an amazing job of making us feel included. And so as companies struggle with diversifying their company, their organization, right? Because representation is about diversity. We want to increase representation for women. We want to increase representation for Black, Latin, Indigenous. While that can take time to get the structures in place from a recruitment standpoint, from a hiring standpoint, from an engagement and a retention standpoint, the one thing that you can go in and have an immediate impact on is inclusion. So for me, I try my best to focus on inclusion and then go after the others. So that's how I think about the work a little different than I
Well,
think people do.
yeah, I know you and I had this conversation, about last summer. That I had predicted. I said we're going to see a spike. We're going to see a spike in people leaving because we're putting right. There was this rush to hire for diversity and putting people in toxic work environments.
Bingo.
And I know you've heard them. We're starting to hear the absolute horror stories, right? Of people being brought into organizations, and I mean, unbelievable what they are being put through because, okay, this company had to sort of check the box or we have to fill this role, and they were set up to fail and
Yeah.
set up to show up at work every day and feel like they don't belong. And that I think one of the things that I've started leading with in those conversations, Solomon, when you're talking about, getting leaders there, is having folks understand that neuroscience of if I feel like I'm excluded, that is the same neural pathways as physical pain.
Yeah.
Do you really want to put your employees through that? The stakes are really high here. And so, right, if I'm just focusing on diversity, I'm putting them in toxic and I'm making people feel that way.
Thank you for digging deeper because you summed it up perfectly. Diversity is great, right? And we all need it. We need different diversity of thinking, diversity of race, diversity of gender. We need the whole intersectionality of diversity. But when you hire employees from diverse backgrounds and you bring them into an environment and the leaders don't know how to accommodate their needs because they're diverse, because they need different needs, because they articulate themselves different, right? They don't feel included. And when they don't feel included, they're definitely not going to feel like they belong. And then what they're going to start doing across the company is if you have employee resource groups, they're going to try to connect there to find people who share similar characteristics. And either they're going to find those people and they're going to tell them, hey, we absolutely love it here. You made a great decision. Or this is not the right company for you. This company doesn't support inclusion and diversity. They say they do, but they don't, right? And I'm lucky that I work for a company who we really, really, like I wouldn't be here if the company wasn't adamant about inclusion and adamant about diversity. We've been on the path since before I got here, since 2016. I'm the first head of I&D and the first hire solely focused on diversity, but the company has been trying to figure out how to do this work since 2016. So before the George Floyd incident and before it became popular, we've been trying to do this work, which is why I came here to continue the legacy.
Right. You can see that arc, right? That it truly is a journey. We're not just
Journey.
I think it's interesting. I don't know if you've seen, Solomon, some of the data that's come out about hybrid work from home, and in particular, Black women and people with disabilities saying how much they do not want to come back to the office because they're not having to code switch anymore. They're not having to cover anymore. They're not having, right, all of that energy that's taken isn't there anymore. So I think that's back to that, like leading with I. Okay, so I want to have us think about, we've talked a lot about the importance of leaders.
Yeah.
And what do you see as some of the most important approaches to getting leaders on board, right? To doing the work and to creating an environment where all employees can thrive.
I talked about it earlier, so I won't spend a lot of time answering this one, but again, it's helping leaders understand why this work matters to them. I mentioned it earlier, but it's less about why it matters to me. It's less about why it matters to the company, and it's more about why it matters to them. Again, people, you said it earlier with them, right? Like, what's in it for me? People get on board and people get attached when they have a why behind it. But also, leaders have not been told that it's okay to talk about inclusion and diversity at work. As a matter of fact, they're scared to talk about it, right? Because if you say the wrong thing, publicly especially, you might get fired or you're going to get shunned. And I think we live in a society that Now, just to be clear, there are some things that people say where they need to get fired. I
Yep.
just want to put it out there. So don't think I'm removing responsibility. But at the same time, I'll give you an example. I was at a previous employer, and a middle-aged white woman asked me, "Should I call you a person of color or a colored person?"
Hmm.
Right? And she genuinely did not know the answer. Now, there's two perspectives. One, as a black man, I could have got mad and said, "How dare she call me a colored person?" Or, I could put my I&D leader hat on and say, "You know what? She really wants to know the answer." And part of the reason people don't ask questions is because they don't want to feel dumb. They don't want people to, and they don't want to offend people, right?
Yep.
And I told her, I said, "Listen, that was a great question. I'll be honest with you. If you would have asked the wrong person that question, they probably would have been upset." I said, "But because we have this great relationship, let me tell you why you should call me what you should call me." And as a matter of fact, I told her I would rather be called black. I don't want to be called a person of color. I don't want to be called African American. I don't want to be called a colored person. I want to be called black. And the moral of the story for me to her was that you really have to take time to get to know people individually. Like, as a black man, I don't speak for all black men across the country, right? And just because I feel the way I feel, someone else may feel completely different. And
Yep.
so your question was about, how to get leaders on board. And for me, again, it's really about helping them understand why this work matters to them. So if you think about that, that's going to take some time, right? And I do this in one-on-one conversations with like SVPs and VPs. Now, some companies have hundreds, right? So the way you do it is you partner with the SVP of a specific business group, right? You get them on board, you become friends with them, and then they invite you to a staff meeting with all of their VPs. That way you go in there with some really intentional information. You get them to disseminate that information across the business unit. And before you know it, you've created a bunch of soldiers across the space. And last thing I'll say is, in order to get leaders on board, we can't make them feel guilty for being who they are.
Absolutely.
Right? Like, I've seen leaders who do this work make white men feel guilty for being white men. And the reality of the work is, like, I love being black. I wouldn't want to be anything else. But I didn't choose to be black, right? I got blessed to be black, right? And so I'm sure you feel like you got blessed to be a white woman. I'm sure everybody feels blessed to be who they are. And so there's this thing called white guilt, right? And when you introduce inclusion and diversity strategies, in order to make it successful across an organization, you need to bring people in. We need allies. So when I'm having these conversations, I put it all out on the table, right? There's this uncomfortable conversation that nobody wants to have, right? Sometimes Black people want to talk about slavery and Jim Crow, right? And rightfully so. And white people will say, well, slavery is in the past. We need to move on from that. And Black people will say, well, can you admit that because of slavery, you may be benefiting from the work that my ancestors did? And white people will say, I bust my butt to get to where I'm at. I haven't benefited. So there's this friction of this uncomfortable conversation. And the reason I know this is because I talk to my peers across the space. I talk to leaders who are white, who are VPs, who are Asian, who are VPs, who are Black, who are VPs. People want to talk about this work, but nobody knows how to talk about it in a way that doesn't offend the other group. So we need a lot of people to listen, to be receptive, to be empathetic, right? The things my mother taught me when I was young,
Yep.
to be patient. And over time, we all want the same thing, right? At the end of the day,
Yes.
I want to be happy. I want to be healthy. I want to make as much money as possible if that's something that I value, right? And I want to feel included. I want to feel part of the group.
Yep.
At the core of our existence, we want the same thing. We're just speaking in different languages and we're butting heads.
I always say, you can trace a lot back to Maslow's hierarchy of needs.
Absolutely.
Right. And I think, Solomon, you haven't called this out specifically, but it has been a theme in every single thing that I've heard you say in your approach, in the way you do things. There's respect and trust and you give people the space to, for example, that exec to say, oh my gosh, and not only is she gay, but she married a Black woman, right? Like you gave the space for uh, to lean into the messy, into the hard, and to make the mistakes, and to say those, to get rid of that fear of saying or doing the wrong thing, and to learn, right, and to lean in, right. So I think we can't ever underestimate how important that growth mindset, psychological safety is in this work, because if we go with blame and shame, and if we go with, because yeah, we should be having the conversations about systemic inequities and where those come from and how that shows up and
Yeah.
what privilege is and how you spend your privilege and how to understand your like all of that. But we can't go there if I feel like it's going to be like, you would not believe what Solomon said, right?
Right. Right. You can't make people feel like you're attacking them. You don't want to make people feel attacked. And you want to have an open and honest dialogue with the goal of how do we continue to move the agenda forward to
Yeah.
create an environment where, yes, I come from Oakland, and yes, I may articulate myself with an urban diction that may be a little different than yours. But at the end of the day, the bottom line is, can I do the job? Right. And if we're getting people to understand that, I believe that, like, I have an 18-year-old son, I have a 10-year-old girl and a 6-year-old boy, and I believe that the next generation, not the millennials, but Generation Z, I believe that that generation is going to be the generation that's going to change the world. Because my son, who's 18, he's a freshman at Berkeley, and all of his friends, they're the ones who are adamant about inclusion and belonging and diversity and just hard work and treating people right. So I'm excited to see what they do.
I am too. I am too. And I think one of the things I don't want us to repeat is, right. So I'm Gen X, and it was supposed to, like, we were at least supposed to solve the gender thing, right? Like
Right.
unconscious bias is real, right? And so we have to even help this next generation understand. And right, you have all of the right mindset and heart behind it, and get real intentional about interrupting unconscious bias. And then I feel like the flywheel is starting to turn.
Yeah.
All right, Solomon, this has been a great conversation. I want you to leave me with one last truth bomb about doing this work.
I would say, I don't know if it's a truth bomb so much as it is some advice. I would recommend that, I'm 45 years old. I would recommend that all of the leaders in my age group, a little bit older, a little bit younger, I recommend you find a millennial or a Generation Z family member or a close friend and ask them, what does successful inclusion and diversity look like? Right? Also, like, sit down with your children and talk to them. If your children are like in the teenage years or early 20s, sit down and talk to, and even smaller children, sit down and talk to them. If you're a man and you lead a team of people that you hired, for the most part, if you have a daughter, if it was bring your kid to work day, how would your daughter rate your team based on gender? Right? My goal is to get leaders thinking about how the teams they're building will impact the future of the workplace.
Oh, I absolutely love that. Thank you so much for coming on, sharing both really practical things that folks can do, great stories, and just leaving me feeling like, again, the flywheel is turning, and knowing that there are leaders like you out there doing this. Keep it up. And for the all of you, thanks for tuning in again. And as you know, get out there and do the next right thing.
Wow, I love that. Thanks, Mo.
Bye bye.